I sit in the sterile HR conference room, watching Director Sandra Walsh slide a termination letter across the mahogany table. "We know you've been meeting with competitors. This is your last day." The words hit like ice water, but I don't flinch. Instead, I lean back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. "You caught me," I say quietly, my voice steady as steel. What Sandra doesn't know is that those competitors were actually patent attorneys, and in 42 hours, everything would change forever. 6 months earlier, I was just another dedicated software engineer at TechFlow Dynamics, a mid-sized company tucked into one of Austin's bustling tech corridors. I loved my job, genuinely believed in what we were building, and spent countless evenings in my cramped downtown apartment working on personal coding projects that pushed the boundaries of what I thought possible. That particular October night, something extraordinary happened. I was experimenting with machine learning algorithms, trying to solve a problem that had been bothering me for months. Data processing speeds were the bottleneck in everything we built at TechFlow, and I knew there had to be a better way. I was combining predictive analytics with quantum computing principles, something I'd been tinkering with since graduate school. Around 2 in the morning, staring at lines of code that seemed to blur together, I had my breakthrough. The algorithm that emerged wasn't just an improvement, it was revolutionary. My testing showed it could increase data processing speeds by 300% while using 40% less computational power. I sat there in my pajamas, coffee growing cold, realizing I might have just stumbled onto something that could change the entire industry. The next Monday, I practically bounced into the office. I found my team lead, Marcus Thompson, hunched over his standing desk with his usual Monday morning scowl. Marcus was one of those guys who seemed perpetually annoyed that other people had ideas, but I'd always figured he was just protective of our department's reputation. "Marcus, you need to see this," I said, pulling up my algorithm on his monitor. "I think I've solved our processing speed problem." He glanced at the screen with the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry. "Looks complicated, Amie. You sure about these numbers? I've run it through every test I can think of. This could revolutionize how we handle client data processing. Imagine what this could mean for our quarterly targets." Marcus scratched his beard. A habit had developed whenever he was thinking hard about something. "Interesting. Why don't you run it through proper channels? Write up a formal proposal. Get it reviewed by the appropriate committees." That should have been my first red flag. In 3 years of working at TechFlow, I'd never seen Marcus suggest more bureaucracy. He was usually the first person to cut through red tape when we had a promising innovation. Weeks passed. I submitted my formal proposal, complete with testing data, projected implementation timelines, and cost-benefit analyses. Nothing happened. When I asked Marcus about it, he'd give me vague responses about management review and strategic planning considerations. Meanwhile, I started noticing things. Whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. Executive meetings that happened behind closed doors with unusual frequency. Sarah Kim from our neighboring development team mentioned that budgets were getting tighter and there were rumors about potential layoffs. That's when I made the smartest decision of my professional life. I started researching patent protection. I'd never thought much about intellectual property law, but something told me I needed to understand my rights. A quick internet search led me to Hayes & Associates, a downtown Austin firm specializing in technology patents. I scheduled a consultation with Jennifer Hayes, their senior partner. Jennifer's office overlooked Lady Bird Lake, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the whole room feel open and honest. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every corporate trick in the book. "Tell me about your algorithm," she said, after I'd explained my situation. I walked her through the technical details, trying not to get too lost in the coding specifics. Jennifer took notes, asked clarifying questions, and nodded thoughtfully. "Amie, this sounds genuinely innovative. Have you documented when and how you developed this?" Most of it was done at home, on my personal equipment. I can show you timestamps, development logs, even some early sketches I made. Jennifer leaned forward. That's important. Tell me about your employment agreement with TechFlow. Do you remember signing anything about intellectual property rights? My stomach dropped. There was a lot of paperwork when I started. I probably signed something, but I don't remember the details. We need to review that carefully. Many tech companies have aggressive IP clauses that can be problematic for employees. The fact that you developed this at home, on your own time, using your own resources, that's significant. But we need to understand what you agreed to. As our meeting concluded, Jennifer gave me homework. Gather every piece of documentation related to my algorithm's development. Find my employment contracts, and start keeping detailed records of everything happening at work. Walking to my car that afternoon, I felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. I'd always believed that innovation should be rewarded, that good work spoke for itself. The possibility that my own company might try to claim ownership of something I'd created entirely on my own time felt like a betrayal I wasn't ready to accept. But during a routine code review the following week, that betrayal became impossible to ignore. I was in Marcus' office, going through some standard maintenance updates, when his phone rang. He answered it on speaker, apparently forgetting I was sitting right there. Marcus, we need to discuss the Patterson algorithm project. Legal wants to know about timeline for filing the patent application. The voice belonged to someone I didn't recognize, but Marcus' response made my blood run cold. We're calling it a proprietary company asset, should be ready to file within the month. It's going to be a major revenue stream. I sat frozen, pretending to study the code on his monitor while my world collapsed around me. They weren't just planning to steal my work. They were already treating it as their own property. That phone call changed everything. I left Marcus' office in a daze, went straight to the parking garage, and called Jennifer Hayes from my car. They're already talking about filing a patent, I told her, my voice shaking. They're calling it company property. Come in tomorrow, Jennifer said immediately. Bring every piece of documentation you have. We need to move quickly. The next evening, I sat across from Jennifer and her colleague, David Rodriguez, a specialist in tech industry intellectual property disputes. David was younger than Jennifer, maybe early 40s. With the intense energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed fighting corporate bullies. This is more serious than we initially thought, Jennifer said, reviewing the employment documents I'd brought. TechFlow does have IP clauses, but they're not as airtight as they think. The key issue is that you developed this algorithm entirely outside of work, using your own resources, addressing a problem that wasn't part of your assigned job duties. David nodded. We see this pattern a lot. Companies get desperate for new revenue streams and start reaching beyond what their contracts actually allow. The problem is, most employees don't know their rights and don't fight back. What are my options? I asked. We build a case, David said. Document everything, every conversation, every email, every instance where they treat your work as their property without your consent. If they file a patent listing themselves as inventors, that's fraud. If they terminate you for refusing to go along with it, that's wrongful termination. But I still work there. How do I document anything without looking suspicious? Jennifer smiled grimly. Very carefully. Use personal devices for any communication with us. Meet us away from your office. And start building relationships with witnesses who can verify the timeline of your innovation. Over the next several weeks, I became a detective in my own workplace. I saved every email that mentioned my algorithm. I documented conversations in a secure notes app on my personal phone. I backed up all my personal development files to multiple cloud storage accounts. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. TechFlow wasn't just planning to steal my algorithm. They were struggling financially, desperate for new intellectual property they could license to stay afloat. I found references to at least 3 other employees whose innovations had been absorbed into company portfolios without proper attribution or compensation. One of them was Beth Martinez, a data scientist who'd left TechFlow 6 months earlier. When I reached out to her, she told me a story that made my stomach churn. They took my predictive modeling framework and filed patents on it, Beth said during our coffee meeting at a cafe far from downtown. When I complained, they said it was developed using company resources and fell under standard IP agreements. I couldn't afford to fight it legally. Did you develop it at work? Partially. But the core innovations were from my graduate thesis, done years before I was hired. They knew that. But they also knew I couldn't prove it without spending more money than I had. These conversations convinced me that TechFlow's behavior was part of a systematic pattern. They were essentially farming innovation from employees, then claiming ownership regardless of the legal or ethical merits of their claims. My evening meetings with Jennifer and David became more frequent and more strategic. We developed a comprehensive plan to protect not just my algorithm, but potentially help other employees who'd been exploited. The key, David explained, is timing. We need to let them make their move first. If they file fraudulent patent applications, if they terminate you for refusing to cooperate, if they start licensing your work without permission, then we have clear evidence of wrongdoing. But won't that damage my career? Being fired? Getting into legal battles? Jennifer leaned forward. Amie, they're counting on you being too scared to fight back. That's how this system perpetuates itself. But if we do this right, if we build an airtight case, you won't just win. You'll establish precedent that protects other innovative employees. The emotional toll was exhausting. Every day at work became an act of theater. I had to smile and collaborate with people who were actively plotting to steal my life's work. I had to attend meetings where my own innovations were discussed as company property while pretending I didn't know what was happening. But the worst part was watching Marcus. Head started presenting preliminary versions of my algorithm to potential clients, describing it as our latest breakthrough in data processing efficiency. He never mentioned my name, never acknowledged my contributions, just took credit for work he couldn't have produced in a million years. During one particularly painful team meeting, Marcus actually lectured the group about the importance of collaborative innovation and company-first thinking. I sat there, biting my tongue, watching him build his career on my stolen work. That night, I called Jennifer with a revelation that changed our entire strategy. They've already filed a provisional patent application. I told her, I found the filing number in some emails I wasn't supposed to see. They've listed Marcus and the company as co-inventors. My name isn't mentioned anywhere. The silence on the phone was deafening. That's fraud. David's voice came through on the conference call. Clear, documentable fraud. They've just handed us the evidence we need to destroy them. After discovering the fraudulent patent filing, everything at TechFlow shifted into a different gear. The corporate paranoia that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly boiled over into open surveillance. It started subtly. I noticed my keycard access logs were being reviewed more frequently. Helena Chen, from IT, mentioned, almost casually, that they were implementing enhanced security protocols that involved monitoring employee computer usage patterns. Then came the questions from HR. Monica Stevens, TechFlow's Deputy Director of Human Resources, scheduled a routine check-in with me. Monica was the kind of person who smiled constantly but never seemed happy about anything. She had a way of asking invasive questions while pretending to be concerned about employee wellness. Amie, we've noticed you've been working some unusual hours lately, Monica said, consulting a folder that seemed suspiciously thick for a routine check-in. There have been some reports of you accessing the building at odd times. I sometimes come in early or stay late to work on projects, I replied carefully. I thought initiative was valued here. Of course. We just want to make sure you're maintaining proper work-life balance. There have also been some questions about outside consulting work. You know, our policies require disclosure of any external professional activities. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. I'm not doing any consulting work. What makes you think I am? Monica's smile became even more artificial. Oh, just routine inquiries. We periodically verify that employees aren't engaging in activities that might create conflicts of interest. You understand. After that meeting, the surveillance became impossible to ignore. New monitoring software appeared on all company computers, ostensibly to optimize productivity and ensure data security. Cameras that had been installed months earlier suddenly seemed to be pointed in different directions. I started varying my routes through the office, paying attention to who was watching me and when. I noticed that certain colleagues had begun asking casual questions about my personal life, my weekend activities, my lunch meetings. It felt like being studied by amateur detectives who'd learned their techniques from television shows, but TechFlow's surveillance efforts were clumsy and obvious. They hired a private investigation firm to monitor problem employees. But the investigators were about as subtle as a marching band. I spotted the same rental car parked outside my apartment building 3 times in 1 week. During a lunch meeting with Jennifer and David at a restaurant downtown, I watched our conversation being photographed from across the street. "They're getting desperate," David observed, reviewing the photos he'd taken of my surveillance. "This level of monitoring suggests they know their legal position is weak. It's also potentially illegal," Jennifer added. "Depending on what methods they're using, this could constitute harassment and intimidation of a potential whistleblower." Our strategy evolved to take advantage of TechFlow's overreach. Instead of trying to hide our meetings, we started documenting their surveillance efforts. Every photograph, every suspicious rental car, every inappropriate question from HR became additional evidence of the company's consciousness of guilt. Meanwhile, I discovered that my work computer was being accessed remotely after hours. Files I'd created were being copied, modified, and redistributed without my knowledge. My email account showed login attempts from IP addresses I didn't recognize. The most disturbing revelation came when I learned that I wasn't the only target. Sarah Kim pulled me aside one afternoon, looking genuinely concerned. "Amie, I think we need to talk," she said quietly. "Somewhere private." We met at a coffee shop near Sarah's apartment, far from downtown in the TechFlow offices. "They've been asking me questions about you," Sarah said. "HR, Marcus, even some people I don't recognize. They want to know about your work habits, who you talk to, whether you've seemed disloyal lately." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful. But Amie, they're doing this to other people too. Jake Wilson from the database team, Emma Rodriguez from user interface design, probably others. Anyone who's developed something innovative lately is being watched." This confirmed what I'd suspected. TechFlow was essentially running an internal espionage operation against their own employees, trying to identify anyone who might challenge their intellectual property theft. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I overheard Sandra Walsh talking to some executives about neutralizing problem employees before they become threats. I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounded ominous." That evening, I met with my legal team to plan our next moves. The surveillance had given us additional evidence of TechFlow's consciousness of guilt, but it also meant our window for action was closing. "They're going to move against you soon," David predicted. "Probably some pretext for termination that lets them claim you violated company policies. Once you're fired, they'll argue that any legal action you take is just disgruntled employee retaliation." "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe weeks," Jennifer said. "We need to be ready to file the moment they make their move." The waiting became excruciating. Every morning, I wondered if it would be my last day at TechFlow. Every meeting felt like it might be a trap. Every email could contain a termination notice. But the worst part was watching my colleagues. Some of them clearly knew something was happening but were too scared to get involved. Others seemed to genuinely believe I was doing something wrong, that the company's suspicions were justified. Marcus had become openly hostile. He excluded me from important meetings, reassigned my projects to other team members, and spoke to me with the kind of condescending tone usually reserved for interns who'd made serious mistakes. Amie, I think it's time you focused on more routine maintenance tasks, he told me during one particularly humiliating conversation. Maybe take a step back from the innovative work until things settle down. Translation. Stop creating anything new that we might want to steal. The breakthrough came when I discovered that TechFlow had already begun marketing my algorithm to major clients. They'd created promotional materials describing it as a revolutionary breakthrough in data processing efficiency, pricing it at millions of dollars in licensing fees. They weren't just planning to steal my work, they were already selling it. The morning of November 15th started like any other day, except for the email waiting in my inbox when I arrived at work. Please report to Conference Room C at 9 a.m. for a routine administrative meeting. Bring your employee handbook. No explanation, no context, just a summons that felt like a death sentence. I knew this was it. 6 months of investigation, documentation, and careful preparation had led to this moment. I gathered the few personal items from my desk, backed up my final batch of evidence files, and walked to Conference Room C with the strange calm that comes from knowing you're about to jump off a cliff. The conference room was TechFlow's most formal meeting space, with a long mahogany table and leather chairs that were supposed to make visitors feel impressed by the company's success. Today, it felt more like a courtroom. Sandra Walsh sat at the head of the table, flanked by Monica Stevens and a man I didn't recognize but assumed was company legal counsel. Their expressions were the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from believing you've caught someone red-handed. Please sit down, Amie, Sandra said, gesturing to the chair directly across from her. The power dynamics were deliberately intimidating, designed to make me feel isolated and defensive. Sandra opened a thick folder and removed several photographs, spreading them across the table like playing cards. The photos showed me at various downtown restaurants, meeting with Jennifer and David. They'd managed to capture us in conversation, though obviously had no idea what we were actually discussing. We know you've been meeting with competitors, Sandra said, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a guilty verdict. These photographs document multiple instances of you sharing confidential company information with representatives of rival firms. I looked at the photos, genuinely curious about how they'd reached such a wildly incorrect conclusion. Those aren't competitors, I said quietly. Don't insult our intelligence, Monica interjected. We've identified the individuals you've been meeting with. They represent technology companies that directly compete with TechFlow's core business areas. The man I assumed was legal counsel leaned forward. Miss Patterson? These meetings constitute a clear violation of your confidentiality agreement. Corporate espionage is not just grounds for termination. It's a federal crime. I almost laughed. The sheer wrongness of their accusations was almost amusing. If it wasn't so professionally devastating, they'd constructed an entire conspiracy theory based on surveillance photos that showed me having lunch with my own lawyers. This is your opportunity to explain yourself, Sandra continued. If you cooperate fully, if you provide details about what information you've shared and what compensation you've received, we might be willing to pursue this matter internally, rather than involving federal authorities. The threat was clear. Confess to crimes you didn't commit, or face prosecution for espionage. It was exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that bullying corporations use to silence employees who threaten their interests. I sat back in my chair, considering my options. I could tell them the truth about the patent lawyers, explain that they'd completely misunderstood the situation, try to salvage my employment at a company that had already betrayed me in the worst possible way. Or I could let them spring their own trap. You caught me, I said simply. The satisfaction on Sandra's face was almost pathetic. She'd convinced herself that she was some kind of corporate detective, uncovering treachery and protecting company secrets. She had no idea she was about to destroy her own career. Monica slid a termination letter across the table. This is effective immediately. You'll be escorted to your desk to collect personal belongings. Then off the premises. Your final paycheck will include payment through today, minus any outstanding obligations to the company. I signed the letter without reading it. None of it mattered anymore. Your laptop and company phone need to be surrendered immediately, the legal counsel said, producing a box for my electronic devices. The escort to my desk was humiliating by design. Marcus stood by my workstation, watching as security personnel supervised my collection of personal items. My colleagues stared from their cubicles, whispering among themselves about what I might have done to deserve such treatment. Sarah Kim approached as I was packing my few personal photographs and office plants. Amie, what's happening? They won't tell us anything. I gave her a hug, knowing it would probably be the last time I'd see her in this context. Everything's going to be fine, Sarah. Trust me. The walk through the TechFlow offices felt surreal. These hallways where I'd spent 3 years building my career. These conference rooms where I'd presented ideas and collaborated with teams. This break room where I'd celebrated colleagues' birthdays and commiserated about impossible deadlines. All of it was ending because a group of executives had decided to steal my work and got paranoid when I sought legal protection. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing what had just happened. I felt oddly relieved. The waiting was over, the pretending was finished, and TechFlow had just made the most catastrophic mistake in the company's history. I called Jennifer Hayes before I even left the parking garage. It's done, I told her. They fired me for meeting with competitors. Perfect, Jennifer said. David's already preparing the filing. Federal court, first thing tomorrow morning. As I drove home, I passed the billboard TechFlow had recently erected on Interstate 35, advertising their cutting-edge data processing solutions. By this time tomorrow, that billboard would represent millions of dollars in false advertising claims, 42 hours and counting. The emergency meeting at Hayes & Associates felt like a war room. Jennifer, David, and 2 other attorneys I hadn't met before surrounded a conference table covered with documents, legal briefs, and evidence files that represented months of careful preparation. Amie, meet Patricia Wong and James Butler, Jennifer said, gesturing to the additional attorneys. Patricia specializes in federal corporate fraud cases, and James handles whistleblower protection. We're bringing in the full team for this. Patricia was probably in her early 40s, with the sharp efficiency of someone who'd spent years prosecuting white-collar criminals. James looked younger, but had the intense focus that suggested he genuinely enjoyed taking on powerful corporations. Your documentation is extraordinary, Patricia said, reviewing the evidence files I'd compiled. Timeline records, email screenshots, witness statements, financial records showing TechFlow's desperation for new revenue streams. This is the most comprehensive employee IP theft case I've ever seen. David spread out TechFlow's fraudulent patent application across the table. This is our smoking gun. They filed this listing Marcus Thompson and TechFlow as inventors, completely excluding Amie, despite having no involvement in the algorithm's development. That's not just theft. It's federal fraud. What's our timeline? I asked. We file first thing tomorrow morning, Jennifer replied. Federal lawsuit for intellectual property theft, wrongful termination, corporate fraud, and violation of whistleblower protection statutes. We're also filing emergency injunctions to prevent TechFlow from using or licensing your algorithm. James pulled out another set of documents. We've been in contact with 3 other former TechFlow employees who've experienced similar treatment: Beth Martinez, Jake Wilson, and Emma Rodriguez. They're all willing to testify about the company's pattern of intellectual property theft. This is bigger than just your case, Patricia added. We're looking at a systematic corporate culture of innovation, theft. If we win this, and we will, it sets precedent for protecting employee rights throughout the tech industry. The scope of what we were attempting began to sink in. This wasn't just about recovering my stolen algorithm or getting compensation for wrongful termination. We were challenging an entire system that allowed corporations to exploit their most innovative employees with impunity. There's something else, David said, consulting his tablet. We've been monitoring TechFlow's activities since your termination. They've scheduled a major press conference for tomorrow afternoon to announce their revolutionary breakthrough in data processing technology. They're planning to take full public credit for your algorithm. The audacity was breathtaking. Less than 24 hours after firing me for allegedly stealing company secrets, they were planning to publicly claim ownership of work they'd stolen from me. That actually works in our favor, Patricia noted. Public fraud is harder to explain away than quiet corporate theft. The more visibility they create around their false claims, the bigger the damages when we prove they're lying. Jennifer handed me a stack of media contact information. We've reached out to investigative journalists who cover corporate malfeasance, TechCrunch, Wired, Austin Business Journal, and several others. They're very interested in this story. What should I expect? A storm, James said bluntly. Once this goes public, TechFlow will throw everything they have at discrediting you. They'll claim you're a disgruntled employee making false accusations. They'll try to dig up anything they can use against your character or professional reputation. But here's the thing, Patricia added. We have the evidence. We have the timeline. We have witnesses. And most importantly, we have their own fraudulent patent filing. They can't argue with federal documents that prove they committed fraud. That evening, I called my parents in Dallas to warn them about what was coming. My mother, who'd spent 30 years as a high school principal, had strong opinions about standing up to bullies. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she said. "Too many people let corporations walk all over them because they're afraid of making waves. You're doing the right thing." My father, a retired engineer who'd spent his career dealing with corporate politics, was more cautious. "Just make sure your lawyers know what they're doing. Big companies have resources to drag these fights out for years. Dad, they made a huge mistake. They filed fraudulent federal documents. This isn't going to be a long fight." I spent that evening reviewing everything one more time, making sure I understood every aspect of our legal strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that didn't guarantee anything. Corporate legal teams had ways of turning clear-cut cases into complicated battles of attrition. But I also knew something TechFlow didn't. My algorithm worked. It was genuinely revolutionary, legitimately valuable, and completely my own creation. The truth was on my side. And truth has a way of winning in the end, especially when it's backed by solid legal representation and comprehensive documentation. The most satisfying part was knowing that TechFlow's own greed had destroyed them. If they'd simply offered to license my algorithm, if they'd acknowledged my contribution and shared the profits fairly, none of this would be happening. Instead, they'd chosen to steal, lie, and intimidate, creating exactly the evidence we needed to destroy them completely. My phone rang around 10 p.m. It was Sarah Kim, Amie. "I don't know what you're planning, but Marcus has been in meetings all day with executives and lawyers. They seem really worried about something. They should be worried." I told her, "Is there anything I should know? Anything that might affect the rest of us?" "Just keep doing good work, Sarah, and don't let them steal it." After hanging up, I realized this was probably the last normal evening of my old life. Tomorrow, everything would change. It'd either become a cautionary tale about employees who bit off more than they could chew, or it'd become a symbol of standing up to corporate theft and winning. I was betting on the latter. 36 hours and counting. At exactly 9 a.m., Patricia Wong filed our federal lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas. The filing included 17 separate counts of misconduct, from intellectual property theft to federal fraud to violation of whistleblower protection statutes. Simultaneously, David Rodriguez filed emergency injunctions with 3 major TechFlow clients. demanding they cease use of my algorithm pending resolution of ownership disputes. The injunctions were based on documented evidence that TechFlow had no legitimate claim to the technology they were licensing. By 10 a.m., TechFlow's legal department was in full crisis mode. Jennifer called me with updates as they developed. Their attorneys are demanding emergency meetings with the federal magistrate. They want the injunctions dismissed immediately, claiming they'll cause irreparable harm to ongoing business operations. What does that mean for us? It means they're panicking. If they had legitimate ownership of your algorithm, they'd be confident in their legal position. Instead, they're scrambling to prevent discovery proceedings that would expose their fraud. The first media coverage appeared around noon. TechCrunch published an investigative piece titled "Austin Tech Company Accused of Systematic Employee IP Theft." The article detailed not just my case, but the broader pattern of exploitation that our investigation had uncovered. TechFlow Dynamics faces federal fraud charges related to allegedly filing patent applications for innovations developed by employees outside of work using personal resources without company involvement, the article reported. Sources close to the investigation suggest this may be part of a systematic effort to claim ownership of employee innovations to generate licensing revenue. By early afternoon, the story had spread to Wired, Austin Business Journal, and several technology industry blogs. The narrative was devastating for TechFlow, a struggling company so desperate for revenue that they'd resorted to stealing innovations from their own employees. But the real catastrophe came at 2:30 p.m., when TechFlow proceeded with their planned press conference despite knowing about our federal lawsuit. Sandra Walsh stood at a podium in TechFlow's main conference room, flanked by Marcus Thompson and several other executives, announcing their revolutionary breakthrough in data processing technology. Today, TechFlow is proud to announce a major advancement in machine learning algorithms that will transform how companies handle large-scale data processing, Sandra proclaimed to an audience of technology journalists and potential clients. Marcus stepped forward to provide technical details, describing my algorithm as if he'd invented it himself. Our team has developed a unique approach combining predictive analytics with quantum computing principles, resulting in processing speed improvements of up to 300%, with significantly reduced computational requirements. What they didn't know was that Patricia Wong was watching the live stream from the federal courthouse, documenting every false claim for our fraud case. The questions from journalists were immediate and devastating. Miss Walsh, are you aware that a federal lawsuit was filed this morning, claiming this technology was stolen from a former employee? Sandra's composed expression cracked slightly. We're confident in our legal position regarding all company intellectual property, Mr. Thompson. Can you explain your specific contributions to this algorithm's development? Marcus fumbled through a vague response about collaborative innovation and team-based problem-solving that convinced no one who understood software development. The press conference became a public relations disaster. Within an hour, technology blogs were comparing the live stream to our federal filing, noting the obvious contradictions and questionable ownership claims. By 4 p.m., TechFlow's largest client, DataCorp Industries, had called an emergency meeting to review their licensing agreement. DataCorp legal team had read our federal filing and realized they might be licensing stolen technology. DataCorp is suspending all payments to TechFlow pending resolution of the ownership dispute, Jennifer reported. That's approximately $2 million in quarterly licensing fees. Two other major clients followed suit by end of business, effectively cutting off TechFlow's primary revenue streams within 6 hours of our filing. The company's response was predictably desperate. Sandra Walsh issued a statement calling me a disgruntled former employee, making false accusations to damage the company that terminated her for legitimate policy violations. But the statement only made things worse by confirming that I'd been fired, which supported our wrongful termination claims. Marcus Thompson published his own response, attempting to claim credit for my algorithm by describing collaborative work sessions that had never happened. Unfortunately for Marcus, I had email records proving he'd never been involved in any aspect of the algorithm's development. The technology industry response was swift and unforgiving. Former TechFlow employees began sharing their own stories of questionable intellectual property practices. Technology leaders publicly condemned the company's behavior. Recruiting firms started reaching out to current TechFlow employees, assuming the company wouldn't survive the legal and public relations catastrophe. Late that evening, Patricia called with the news it'd been waiting for. DataCorp wants to meet with you directly, she said. They're interested in licensing your algorithm from you personally, at triple the rate they were paying TechFlow. Is that legal? Once we prove ownership, which we will, you'll be free to license your technology to anyone you choose. DataCorp legal team has reviewed our evidence and believes our claims are legitimate. The irony was perfect. TechFlow's own client was abandoning them to work directly with the employee whose innovation they'd stolen. But the best news came around midnight, when James Butler called with an update from our media contacts. The Austin Business Journal is running a front-page story tomorrow about corporate intellectual property theft in the local tech industry. They're using your case as the centerpiece, but they found similar situations at 4 other companies. This is becoming a movement. I hung up the phone and realized that what had started as a personal fight for justice had become something much larger. We weren't just challenging one company's theft of one algorithm. We were exposing an entire system of corporate exploitation that had been hidden in plain sight. 24 hours earlier, it'd been a fired employee with a legal theory. Now, I was at the center of a federal case that was reshaping how the technology industry thought about employee rights and corporate responsibility. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or catastrophe. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like justice was actually possible. The settlement offer arrived at 7 a.m. Delivered by a team of TechFlow attorneys who looked like they hadn't slept in days. They want to meet immediately, Jennifer told me over the phone. Full legal teams, neutral location, complete resolution. We met at the Austin Convention Center, in a conference room that felt more like a United Nations negotiation than a corporate dispute. TechFlow's entire executive team sat across from us, flanked by 6 attorneys who seemed to be in various states of professional panic. Sandra Walsh, who'd fired me with such confidence just 3 days earlier, now looked like someone facing personal bankruptcy. Marcus Thompson couldn't make eye contact with anyone in the room. Miss Patterson, began TechFlow's lead counsel, a distinguished gentleman who clearly specialized in corporate damage control. Our clients are prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement that acknowledges certain irregularities in how your innovations were handled. Patricia Wong reviewed the settlement terms with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years extracting justice from reluctant corporations. TechFlow was offering full ownership rights to my algorithm, removal of their fraudulent patent applications, substantial financial compensation, and public acknowledgement of their misconduct. The financial package includes $2 million in direct compensation, plus ongoing royalties from any future licensing of the algorithm, Patricia explained. They're also agreeing to establish a fund for other employees who may have been similarly affected, but the most satisfying element was the required public apology. Sandra Walsh would personally issue a statement acknowledging that TechFlow had inappropriately claimed ownership of employee innovations developed outside of work, and that I was the sole inventor and rightful owner of the algorithm they'd tried to steal. We accept, I said, before anyone could suggest further negotiations. The signing took less than an hour, but the implications would last much longer. TechFlow agreed to implement new policies protecting employee intellectual property rights. Sandra Walsh and Marcus Thompson submitted their resignations as part of the settlement. The company committed to cooperating with federal investigations into their broader pattern of IP theft. Walking out of that conference room, I felt like I was leaving one life and entering another. 3 days earlier, it'd been a terminated employee with an uncertain future. Now, I owned valuable intellectual property, had substantial financial resources, and had become an accidental symbol of employee rights in the technology industry. The media coverage that afternoon was extraordinary. Every major technology publication covered our settlement, treating it as a landmark victory for employee innovation rights. The Austin Business Journal ran a follow-up story about how our case was inspiring other employees to challenge corporate IP theft. But the most meaningful response came from DataCorp Industries. Their CEO, Margaret Chen, called me personally to discuss licensing my algorithm directly. "Miss Patterson, we've reviewed your technology thoroughly. It's genuinely revolutionary, and we want to establish a partnership that properly compensates you for your innovation," she said. "We're prepared to offer a 5-year exclusive licensing agreement worth $15 million. $15 million! For an algorithm I'd developed in my pajamas during late-night coding sessions. Within a week, I'd received similar offers from 4 other major corporations. The algorithm I'd created to solve a personal coding problem had become the foundation for what would clearly become a very successful technology company. I decided to found Patterson Innovations in the same downtown Austin building where Jennifer Hayes had first explained my legal rights. The irony felt appropriate. A company built on protecting innovation. Located where I'd learned to protect my own innovations. My first hire was Sarah Kim, who left TechFlow immediately after reading about our settlement in the newspaper. My second hire was Beth Martinez, the data scientist whose story had first alerted me to TechFlow's systematic exploitation of employees. I want to build a company where innovation is protected and properly compensated. I told them during our first team meeting. No employee should ever have to choose between creating something amazing and keeping their job. Within 6 months, Patterson Innovations had grown to 23 employees, all refugees from companies that had failed to properly value their contributions. We developed a comprehensive intellectual property policy that ensured employees retained ownership of innovations developed outside of work, while creating fair revenue-sharing agreements for company-supported projects. The speaking engagements began almost immediately. Technology conferences invited me to discuss employee IP rights, corporate ethics, and the importance of protecting innovation. Law schools asked me to guest lecture about whistleblower protection and federal fraud statutes. But the most rewarding moment came 8 months later, when Congress passed the Employee Innovation Protection Act. Legislation directly inspired by our case. The law established clear federal standards for corporate intellectual property claims and created penalties for companies that fraudulently claim ownership of employee innovations. During the bill signing ceremony, I stood in the Rose Garden next to other advocates for employee rights, watching the president sign legislation that would protect countless future innovators from the exploitation I'd experienced. This law ensures that the people who create the technologies that drive our economy are properly rewarded for their contributions, the president said during his remarks. Innovation belongs to the innovator. The personal cost of the fight had been significant. Relationships with former colleagues who'd believed TechFlow's version of events were permanently damaged. The stress of federal litigation had taken a toll on my health and emotional well-being. The public attention, while mostly positive, had been overwhelming. But the benefits extended far beyond personal vindication. Patterson Innovations was thriving. My algorithm was generating substantial revenue for multiple companies, and the legal precedent we'd established was protecting other employees from corporate exploitation. Most importantly, I'd learned that standing up to powerful institutions was not just possible, but essential. The courage to fight back when someone tries to steal your work doesn't just protect your own future. It creates a better world for everyone who dares to innovate. I often think about that morning in TechFlow's conference room, watching Sandra Walsh slide that termination letter across the table. At the time, it felt like the end of my career. In reality, it was the beginning of something much more meaningful. Sometimes the greatest injustice becomes the catalyst for the most important victory. When someone tries to steal your innovations, they're not just taking your work, they're underestimating your strength. The courage to fight back doesn't just protect your own future. It creates a better world for everyone who refuses to let their creativity be exploited. Innovation belongs to the innovator. Justice belongs to those brave enough to demand it. Have you ever had to stand up to a company or authority figure who was treating you unfairly? What gave you the courage to fight back? Or what held you back? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help it reach others who might be facing similar challenges. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that justice is possible even against powerful opponents. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, your innovations, your creativity, and your courage matter more than you know. Until next time, keep fighting for what's yours.